introduction. Yes, we have. Hi, well, thanks very much, Chris, for that introduction. And I would say there is no doubt that we're going through a period of change. But the politics of it and the froth and so on might not be the most interesting part of it. Certainly for me, 2 years ago, when Lee Sedol was challenged by AlphaGo. Lee Sedol was the world champion of the game of Go, and he was challenged by AlphaGo, which was the brainchild of DeepMind, an arm of Google, to play a set of 5 games of Go. And AlphaGo won 4 out of those 5 games. This had been on the basis of huge amounts of trials of this artificial intelligence working with other Go players and so on, the end of a very long process. A year later, the next iteration of AlphaGo, AlphaGo 0, then played the then world champion and beat him straight off. Earlier this year, the third iteration, Alpha 0, had not practiced with any humans before and had only had 12 hours being given the basic rules of Go, and managed to beat all comers, the previous iterations and humans. But of course, you know, what we're going through now is not just these very specialized artificial intelligence. We're dealing with much broader processes that are going on here. This is not a map of the world. This is these are the connections, 500 billion connections on Facebook, plotted by longitude and latitude. And that's an enormous number. It's 5 times the total number of humans that have ever lived on the planet. But at the same time, only a quarter of the number of links that there are on Wikipedia, which are growing really fast. So, I mean, I think it's incontrovertible. We're moving into a new age. Some people have called it the information age. How do we understand this? How do we get our head around what is happening to us? Understand what's happening now, and also perhaps make some predictions about the future. Well, I like people who take a historical event or a process and then try to see what similarities there might be with what's going on now. So there are many of these, but I'll just pick out a very few. An early one was a couple of authors who suggested that the invention of the internet was very similar in its effects on society to exactly 100 years previous the invention of the internal combustion engine. A more recent thesis put forward by Paul Mason is that what we're going through now is another industrial revolution, very similar to the first industrial revolution, and the impact of that first one we can use as a way of understanding maybe what comes after this latest one. And a third way of looking at this by John Norton, the Cambridge professor for the understanding of the internet, is to look back at the invention of the printing press. So in the mid-15th century, Gutenberg invented, or put together at least, this printing press, and John Norton suggests that it had huge implications for the birth of science, the breakup of the Christian church, and other things. The problem about these approaches, though I like them, is that it's a single event. So we don't really know which bits out of that previous event should we see as being important, which bits give us some kind of understanding of what we're going through at the moment. And that's why, as Chris was saying, I'm particularly drawn to the work of John Maynard Smith and Eörs Szathmáry, because they look across 8 major transitions in the way that information is stored and transmitted since the beginning of life on Earth up until the evolution of modern humans and language. And I was reading this book, for work, not so much for pleasure, and I finally got to the last page and I was totally gobsmacked, because on the last page they say, we are evolutionary biologists. We have to stop at that point. That's the end of the evolutionary major transitions. But in our view, there are 2 further major transitions, and they are human inventions. The first one is the invention of writing, and the second, the invention of computer technology. And it's the major transition that we're going through at the moment. Well, I was just totally amazed, couldn't believe what I was reading, and thought I would start trying to think about this. And my first thought was, the best thing to do is to offer Chris a talk, and then that will force me into thinking about it, because I'm going to have to stand up in front of Rag and today others as well. Okay. So how does this work exactly? Well, what Maynard Smith and Szathmáry are suggesting is that evolution by natural selection in itself doesn't lead to increased complexity. But we know, of course, that from the earliest life on Earth, we have had these increases in complexity. And they suggest that those have been caused by an element of natural selection, which is heredity. So the way in which information is passed from one generation to the next, the way that information is coded, when there are changes in that, then you can get these amazing leaps in complexity. And they suggest that there have been these 8, and of these 8, 6 were unique, and 2 of them happened more than once, suggesting that complex life as we currently know it is vanishingly unlikely. And it's interesting that it's only on the 3rd of these major transitions do you get the origin of DNA and the genetic code, and only on the 6th that you get the shift from single cell to multicellular organisms in plants, animals and fungi. Okay, so as I was saying, the advantage of their approach is that they have 8 of these transitions. We don't have to limit ourselves to one. We can look at the features of these 8 different transitions and draw out similarities that have taken place across these 8 and use those then to make predictions or to understand the current situation and make predictions about the future. And the important thing about each of these transitions is that the only way that the transition can happen is through a major event of cooperation. So what we're talking about is natural selection leading us to intense cooperation. Now, cooperation is very, very difficult to evolve, very rare does it evolve. But it's absolutely essential for the evolution of complex life on Earth. So the first feature of their of their features is that we move, as Chris was saying, from independent replicators to those replicators cooperating together to replicate as one larger now organism. So let's take the example of the single cell moving to the multicellular organism. And once that transition has taken place, there is no way back. There's no way that individual cells can kind of fall off the new organism and start replicating on their own again. That transition has taken place. But with any attempt at cooperation, take strike action, for example, there is always the problem that you have free riders. If you were not being so generous, you might call them cheats.
Scabs.
Wouldn't go that far. How do you deal with that? Well, evolution has dealt with it in three ways. Firstly, that there needs to be genetic similarity between the elements within the new organism. And in a multicellular organism, each cell has exactly the same copy of DNA, and that reduces the advantage of a single cell trying to replicate on its own. Secondly, the division of labour. The division of labour means that the new organism is far more effective, far more efficient than the individual organisms before. So, for example, in our multicellular organism, you have organs, specialised cells doing a function that is specific to them, and that's much, much more efficient than having a single cell trying to do all the functions that are necessary for life. And the third is central control. So again, in our multicellular organism, you now have a nervous system that is coordinating the whole of the new organism, is ensuring that the organs are working in cooperation, in synchrony with each other. And I'm going to add a further feature. Chris actually suggested this one a couple of years ago, and that's extinction. And on my further reading of Maynard Smith and Szathmáry, I think they hint at this too. And that is that not necessarily exactly extinction, but at least a diminution of the previous form once once the transition takes place and the new organisms are there. Okay, I'm not going to go through all the different 8 transitions. You'll be happy to hear. I'm going to focus on the last 2 of Maynard Smith and Szathmáry's, partly because I work on the 7th of them. That's and the origin of animal societies, and the 8th, of course, is the central concern of the radical anthropology group. And then, having seen perhaps how these transition features are used or are relevant in those 2 transitions, we can then move on to the 2 that Maynard Smith and Szathmáry suggest. So, starting with animal societies, and I study primates. 75 million years ago, primates looked perhaps something similar to this modern-day aye, but the essential point is that they were nocturnal and solitary. They lived on their own. Males and females only came together for mating. And somewhere between 40 and 50 million years ago, there was a shift. And now groups of primates live together just like these vervet monkeys do. So I did some work with a couple of colleagues, and we actually used Bayesian methods very similar to the methods that AlphaGo used in its championship matches against Lee Sedol.
I'm sorry, what's Bayesian method? Could you?
Well, Bayesian methods are ways of generating probabilities.
Okay.
So what we do is we take a family tree, here a family tree of primates, and we collect data to put on the tips of that family tree. We then run evolution effectively millions and millions of times, and so that we get we generate probabilities across this family tree of species to understand what were the processes to get to the position that we can currently see at the moment. So we were able to test a number of models for the way that primates evolved sociality. So one suggestion is that it was a kind of gradual, stepwise movement from solitary individuals to small family groups to larger groups based around a single male, and finally to multi-male, multi-female groups. Another is that primates, like other animals, respond to their environment, and therefore if the environment changes, they're likely to change their social system in response to that. And we ran these against a model that was thrown up by the data. And to our great surprise, what we found was that it was the data-derived model that was far more likely than the other two. And this model suggests that there is a transition directly from solitary living into large multi-male, multi-female groups, shifts back and forth between multi-male and unimale groups, and transitions into pair living, or what we might call monogamy. And we wanted to know why this may have happened. One suggestion put forward by primatologist Richard Wrangham is that sociality evolved out of female bonded groups. So daughters would stick with their mother and not disperse as they got towards adulthood, and this was the way that groups were formed. So we ran that in conjunction with the changes in social systems, and what we found was there was correlated evolution between these two traits, but this bonded nature of primate groups followed the shift to social living, didn't precede it, so it couldn't have been the cause. The other suggestion is that it's about the shift in the way that primates live, if they change from solitary living to nocturnal living to daytime living. And again, we tested this, and we found that indeed there was strong correlation between those two traits, and the possibility, it seemed as though they almost did it at exactly the same time, but a small possibility that the shift to daytime living might have preceded it. Okay, so how do the transition features help us to understand what was going on in primate social evolution? Well, it's certainly the case that solitary individuals formed groups and then would replicate as part of that group. And our analyses suggested that there was no way back once that shift had taken place. There is genetic similarity and increased genetic similarity once there was a move to what's called sex-biased dispersal, whereby there was much more bonding within the group, and that caused genetic similarity. The division of labour is a bit more difficult to work out. I mean, I think maybe it's perhaps something to do with predation risk. Certainly that was probably the main cause for the initial shift, that daytime living primates needed to have protection against the much increased predation risk, and if you can share that around a group, then you're much more likely to survive. Central control within primate groups is essentially hierarchical. So there are hierarchies with an alpha animal at the top of that, but it's not purely based on brawn. These dominance hierarchies are often based on kind of alliances, especially amongst apes and some catarrhine monkeys. There are alliances that are formed, and this could well have been the driver for increased brain size across primate evolution. And as far as extinction is concerned, well, recent work that I've been doing trying to look back at how, where and when sociality first appeared, what we found is that the first fossil primates that we can suggest were group living lived about 40 million years ago in what is now Myanmar. And as you can see, the red of group living here, once group living had evolved, all the descendants of those lineages stayed as group living. A lot of extinction here of the solitary primates, and only this one single group of tarsiers that remained solitary. And even those, it is suggested, they may have switched to group living and then back to solitary, which is a bit unfortunate for the theory, I grant you. Okay, let's now move on to the next major transition. Now, I'm not going to go into detail on this because, of course, all of RAG would be able to recite this entirely from memory. So I will skip very quickly over this. But what we do know is that language evolved once, that it is digital in its form, and that all human societies have language. And it provided an incredible advantage to modern humans with the culture that was linked to it, such that modern humans were able to expand, first of all, into the territories of other human species, and then very quickly across the whole of the globe. But as Chris will have pointed out many times, there's a real problem with the evolution of language. Animal signalling is essentially very costly, because the signaller and the animal receiving the signal have a conflict of interest. And therefore, only a very costly signal can be trusted in those circumstances. How do you then evolve something like language, which is a very low cost form of communication? You have to have an absence of a conflict of interest. You need to be able to trust. There needs to be trust between the signaller, the speaker, and those that are listening to them. And, of course, Chris makes a suggestion as to how that trust could have been generated before language and the associated culture took off from that. Okay, so how does that fit with the transition features? Well, certainly we move from a position of small, isolated groups into large networks across the landscape. But now, as well as a lot of genetic similarity between groups, much higher similarity in humans than compared to chimpanzees or other of our close relatives. But of course, what we're adding now is cultural similarity, and it's that culture that takes the language across the networks of modern humans. The division of labour, Maynard Smith and Szathmáry suggests, is between men and women. And again, that fits very, very neatly with sex strike theory. The suggestion that females are clubbing together in order to encourage whatever men to carry out particular duties, like getting fresh meat, for example, for them. So this division of labour, there's definitely connections between sex strike theory and major transitions theory. And then central control. Well, I mean, we've heard from Jerome earlier this week with his discussions about egalitarianism in hunter-gatherers and so on. What is crucial, I think, about early hunter-gatherer societies is not a kind of static conception of equality, but rather a kind of cyclical way in which equality is produced. So it's a cycle of, in sex strike theory at least, of the females taking control at the dark moon and then relinquishing that control at the full moon. And it's this cycle, this change back and forth of taking control and releasing control that ensures that egalitarianism survives. And of course, in terms of extinction, well, we're the only human species left. All the other humans have gone extinct. And this is in marked contrast to the other great ape genera. So, gorillas, chimpanzees, orangutans, there are all at least 2 species and often more. Right, okay. So we've had a very quick run through how those features might fit with the last 2 of Maynard Smith and Szathmáry's transitions. Can these features help us to understand what they suggest are the next 2? So starting with writing. Symbolic representation, these scratches on a lump of ochre found in the Blombos cave in South Africa, dated to about 70,000 years ago, could possibly be some kind of counting system or notation or something or other like that. But in writing systems, we're not dealing with that. What we're talking about is a fully formed writing system. And the first was cuneiform. It was invented in Sumeria, what is now southern Iraq, about 5,000 years ago. And very soon after that, in Egypt, hieroglyphs were invented too. Probably the idea was copied, but clearly the actual forms weren't. And it's incredible how the timing of this invention of writing fitted with the emergence of states in those areas. So this is Menes. He's the first pharaoh, and he united Egypt within a few hundred years of the invention of writing. Very soon after, Gilgamesh, who then became a great mythic figure, but was real, and he united the city-states the literate city-states of Sumeria. Now, some people have suggested that large-scale, complex society came about because of agriculture. I think this map suggests otherwise. 5,000 years ago, this is the spread of agriculture. North Africa, Europe, and into Western Asia. But at the same time, only two of the first two states had arose there. Agriculture had been going for 5,000 years by that point. Even the Bronze Age was in this kind of area. And what we see is writing and state emergence almost hand in hand, or in fact hand in hand. And of course there are particular features that we can look for in terms of states. There's been a bit of a discussion recently about walls. Well, this is the first wall. It was built by Gilgamesh around the city of Uruk 5,000 years ago, but perhaps in contrast to the idea of the current walls, this wall was built as much to keep people in as it was to keep people out. And then, of course, after cuneiform and hieroglyphs, we get the invention of the alphabet. Probably on the coast of the Mediterranean, maybe in a city called Byblos, along the coast near current-day Lebanon or Syria. The alphabet, a digital form of writing based on the phonemes and not the words as a whole, really took off and started to spread through Europe and through Asia, taking with it the emergence of the state. So the state was moving at the same or similar pace to writing as it spread. Okay, so how does this fit with the transition features? Well, I think that writing took the situation in the Neolithic of agricultural peoples, some of them even brought together in large towns, but with no systematic form of control, occasionally egalitarian, occasionally not maybe, but no systematic way of organising into the state. And the state then began to control society. Cultural similarity, well, we get cultures developing within states that are very different from hunter-gatherer kind of cultures. The culture that is developed in a state actually can induce the people within that state to fight for the survival of the state and even die for it. Not a thing that hunter-gatherers would be willing to sacrifice themselves for. The division of labour, well, I mean, clearly this is based on writing, or should we say literacy, a very, very, very small elite of the literate controlling all the resources within the state, and everybody else, the illiterate mass, having to work for those elites. And the central control, well, this is the institutions of the state. As Chris was saying, I seem to be moving rather fast in the direction of anarchism. Never thought I would, but as you kind of see these features of the state, apparent 5,000 years ago and still in place, still being so dominant, the church, the army, other kinds of institutions of the state determining this central control on behalf of this small elite of literate people. And extinction. Well, the states have a habit of wiping out cultures that are not immediately absorbable and taking in the rest. And researchers have suggested that basically over the last 400 years there are no societies left on the planet that are not in some way under the control of the state. And then, of course, as John Norton rightly said, we get the invention of the printing press. He argues that that brought about science and the split of the Christian church. Sure. What seems really important to me is it increased the level of literacy. Now, I don't know, I'm not a historian, and if any of you are, I'm sure you're going to shout me down. But it would be interesting to know if the kinds of revolts, uprisings, slave uprisings in Rome, for example, or the peasants' revolt here, down the road in London, were they materially different from those kinds of revolts that took place after the invention of the printing press? Let's say, the Levellers and the English Civil War, the French Revolution, the American Revolution, and so on. It seems to me that there is an essential difference, and the difference is that the previous revolts were all about the division of labour. They were about, people not getting enough of the of subsistence going towards them. After the invention of the printing press, and particularly the vast increase in literacy that followed, you start getting demands for changes in the way that society is controlled. Egalitarianism, democracy, all of those kinds of demands being voiced. I have no idea whether I'm right or wrong, but it seems like an interesting thing to have a look at. Okay, so now the computer age. Maynard Smith and Szathmáry suggest that we are currently going through this transition. It's not that we're waiting for the revolution, it's happened. And now we're getting clear-up time. How do we put together this new form that we've been given? Well, I think it's more than poignant that one of the largest tech companies that is part of changing society at the moment should use the name of the alphabet from the previous major transition as the name for its parent company. Anyway, leave that. Computer technology based on the binary code, digital, just like the alphabet, language, DNA before it. And of course you can trace the origins of computing back to many different places. But a very important staging post, at least along that, was Alan Turing's theoretical paper where he laid out the possibility of actually producing a computer that works. And very soon afterwards, he was asked to use that theory, to put it into practice in order to crack the Enigma code at Bletchley Park during the Second World War. And not very long after that, the first programmable digital electronic computer, called Colossus for fairly obvious reasons, was produced in 1944. But of course, that computer just held information within it. It didn't actually do transmission. And I don't know quite how Michael Caine got in on this picture, but in any case, he's sitting at what was called ARPANET, the predecessor to the internet. And then Tim Berners-Lee, who invented HTML code, which was the basis for the World Wide Web, when I guess most of us suddenly started looking up and taking some notice. Maybe he is the one who started the revolution. But now we have a situation where, you know, the internet is this amazing network linking up IP addresses, computers across the world to such an extent that people have made comparisons with another network so that they can call the internet the brain of brains. How can the transition features then help us to understand what it may be that we're dealing with here and how it might go in the future? Well, I would argue that the world has tilted on its axis, and there is no going back. We can't uninvent computer technology, and in fact it's moving faster and faster, as we could see with AlphaGo. And of course we are getting huge social change in its wake. And a lot of backlash to the changes and a lot of upset. I understand that. What seems to me in terms of similarity, cultural similarity, is that we are now starting to get great blocks across the earth where there is cultural similarities. It's gone way beyond the kind of the states. Culture is spreading out from being confined to individual states. And I mean, I'd only suggest something like the discussion about Brexit is exactly this sort of argument between the people who want culture to remain a nation-state issue and those of us who want to go much broader and have a much more internationalist conception of culture. And it seems to me that this is one of the major changes that is currently taking place. Let me explain. This was the front page of the Wall Street Journal last year. This young man is sitting on a railway truck in New Delhi train station, and he's communicating with his family back in rural India. But both he and they are illiterate. He's using a smartphone, he's doing voice to text on WhatsApp, and they, back in rural, some village in India, are doing text to voice in order to understand what he's telling them about the big city. This, for me, has huge implications for literacy. For the first time in 5,000 years, literacy is no longer the insurmountable barrier for people to access information, to use that information, and to communicate that information. I think that is revolutionary. And of course, that voice to machine communication is based on AI. And AI is having huge impact on society. You know, of course, we know about autonomous vehicles. You know, my prediction, I said it last time I was here to some snorts, but I'll say it again. I would say that within the next decade, the most dangerous drivers will be banned from driving on the public road.
Humans.
Humans. And that, of course, has implications because, I mean, there are over 1 million commercial drivers in the UK whose jobs will radically change or completely disappear. But before the rest of us start to feel all kind of fine about that, okay, it's menial jobs that are going to be taken over by AI. For AI, menial jobs means being a doctor, being a lawyer, being an accountant. And I think those last two are particularly instructive. Surely those were the first two professions that were absolutely crucial to the early state. They needed to develop laws about how you could move goods and so on, and you needed to tax them. And those two professions in this major transition are probably going to be one of the earliest ones to be taken over by AI. So, what about central control? Well, as I see it, the network has lifted off the face of the earth. It is no longer geographically bound. We can communicate with our friends around the world as easily as people here on the picket line. And how is that central control going to manifest itself? Well, those are kind of difficult questions, and I think we all need to try and struggle with them. This image came to me. If the people are these waves crashing in on the rocks, and the institutions of the state are these rocks, it seems to me that, okay, we haven't got to the point where those rocks have turned to sand, but every time there is a new movement, we get a pulling away of the camouflage of the surface, so that we can really see how these state institutions work. So that they're now not nearly such pretty grass-covered hills. They are very sharp rocks, and of course they've got teeth and they fight back. But I would put my money on the sea and the waves rather than those rocks. And of course, extinction. I mean, it is the case that languages are going extinct at about the rate of 30 to 50 a year, faster than biological extinction. And currently, more than half the world's population speak less than 10 languages. And again, a prediction from me is that English will become the world language. But before any of us who are native English speakers get too happy about that, I don't think it'll be an English that we understand. But of course, that's the previous transition. What about the very last one? How is the extinction working there? Well, I would say that the state was on very, very rocky ground. Taxation, the absolute bedrock, the basis of state control and apparatus. I mean, we know from the Panama Papers and the Paradise Papers that anybody who earns any decent amount, which doesn't include any of us, don't pay any taxes. The discussion recently about tech companies has brought up a situation that, frankly, has lasted for decades now, where large transnational companies don't pay tax. And the state can't really control migration, the movement of goods and services, or even capital flows. So I think the state is getting close to extinction, even if it hasn't finally been pushed over the brink. Okay, that was like a gallop through major transition theory and bumping into sex drive theory and so on. What do we do about it? Well, Maynard Smith and Szathmáry give us a suggestion. Every time when you are moving from in a major transition, so you're going from this independent replicators to replicating as part of the new whole, you need to engender cooperation. We need to engender cooperation. That's what we need to do. We need to write the rules which ensure that people don't cheat, that we don't have free riders on the system. Now, I'm sure, how many students and academics do we have across the UK? How many across, the Western world? How many now people who are enabled by voice communication with computers? Billions of us. Surely we can come up with some very simple rules which mean that cheats and free riders can no longer hold reign over us anymore. And what's crucial for us as anthropologists, surely, is that we develop a new myth. The myth of Gilgamesh, wonderful though it is a myth for the previous transition. That was the myth that enabled and helped people to make sense of the changes that were taking place then. We need a new myth, one that gives us a sense of who we are going to become. And I think that the way that we need to work is that humans and artificial intelligence work together. That we see there as being no conflict of interest between us. That we work together in ways that will be hugely productive for the population, the human population on Earth. And let me just leave you with a suggestion. This is a centaur, half person, let's say, half horse. Can we come up with a centaur-like creature that is half human and half AI? That is the basis for the new myth that would unite the whole of the human population across the world. Thanks very much.